Welcome to the University of Melbourne for this conference on employment services for the future, ideas from Australia and around the world, supported by our generous sponsors, Jobs Australia, the National Employment Services Association and the Westgate Community Initiatives Group. My name is Helen Sullivan. I'm the Professor and Director of the Centre for Public Policy, which is the organisation that's hosting this conference today. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of this land, and pay respect to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to any other Indigenous Australians present. The Centre for Public Policy's core purpose is to support sustained improvement in public policy and public services through research, teaching, and public engagement and debate. We see all our activities as interconnected, with new knowledge generated through research, informing our teaching programmes, and insights generated through public engagement activities, providing important pointers for the direction or depth of our ongoing research programme. This approach has sustained the Centre for more than 30 years and informed the content of our long-standing Master's programme in Public Policy and Public Management. This programme has supported Victorian public servants since the late 1990s and now has a very diverse international cohort with students from Asia, Africa and South America, all contributing their knowledge and experience for the benefit of the programme and for each other. It's also the reason that we have such a strong commitment to regular public events, opportunities for public policymakers to engage directly with citizens and communities. And getting involved in the Centre for Public Policy is easy, and for those of you who aren't involved and would like to be, you can sign up via our website or just leave your email address at the reception and we'll do the rest for you. This commitment to better public policy and better public debate is a key element of the University of Melbourne's mission. And it's for this reason that this year we're launching a new venture, School of Government, which will bring together arts, law and business and economics in a new approach both to teaching and research to further improve our contribution to public policy making and public services. We'll be bringing together researchers to develop bold and independent research on complex, pressing contemporary problems, and also developing new and innovative ways of teaching future public service leaders and public service deliverers. The Centre for Public Policy is at the heart of these developments, and it promises to be a very exciting journey. Now, as you will all know, public policy and public services regularly face new challenges, and the Centre's current programme is directly concerned with two pressing ones: the impact of austerity and fiscal constraint on public service delivery, and the prospect of the Asian century. Both require policymakers, service providers and researchers to think in different ways about how to fund, design and deliver public services, the respective role of the state, the market and the not-for-profit sector, and the interaction of new ideas with established institutions and traditions. And the aim of today's conference is to think about these challenges in the context of social policy and employment services, and to generate new knowledge and insight from our very own and different experiences. The Centre has a long-standing interest in social policy and the reform of employment services, centred on the excellent work undertaken over many years by Professor Mark Considine and his research team, currently led by Siobhan O'Sullivan. And at this point, I'd like to point out you have many things in your conference bags, but one of the things you have is this report. This report is that this is the first time this research has been published, so you're seeing it before anybody else. And it is the first time that the research team has undertaken a comparison of just Australia and the UK. So not only are you getting this early, you're also getting a slightly different perspective than the research team have offered before. So I really do urge you to review that. I know that Mark and Siobhan will be talking about it throughout the day, but it's definitely worth a look. The conference is rich with contributors and experts from many parts of the world, and we are confident that the range of panels and papers will provide a great basis for discussion and debate. We are particularly pleased to welcome the following international guests who will present at the conference and will speak at this first session: David Grubb from the OECD, Els Sol from the University of Amsterdam, Flemming Larsen from Denmark, and Thomas Bredegaard, also from Denmark. The conference will provide an opportunity also to hear from Mark, as I've said, and his team about the latest findings for research. And it will also feature a special stream hosted by the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, who are long-standing partners of the University and the Centre, who want to focus particularly on the impact of the DWAR Innovation Fund. We're particularly pleased also to welcome our keynote speaker, Greg Ashmead, who will be speaking at the end of the conference. He's the Managing Director of Global Operations of Ingeus and has unrivaled experience of understanding and responding to workforce participation challenges faced by a wide variety of client groups in many different countries. And at the end of today, he'll be offering his insights about what he thinks the future trajectories for employment services are. Now, putting on a conference like this, as you would imagine, requires a great deal of support and a great deal of planning. And we have benefited enormously from the financial, spiritual and physical support of Jobs Australia, NISA and WCIG. And we're very grateful to them for that support. We're also incredibly grateful to Siobhan and Sue Olney for the incredible work that they've done. Siobhan in having the idea for the conference, Sue for being prepared to organise and administer the many abstracts that came in and trying to present them in a coherent and helpful way. And none of what we do would have been possible without the excellent work of Georgie Cahill, who you will all have met as you've come in today, the CPP events manager, who is incomparable in her organisational ability. I'm grateful to them all for their contributions, and if there is anything that you need throughout the day, please do feel free to approach either Georgie or Sue, myself or Siobhan. Before we go into the first session, which will be chaired by Siobhan O'Sullivan, we have somebody else who would have liked to come today but couldn't make it, but instead has sent us a personal message, the Minister Kate Ellis MP. So we're just going to hear from her now, I think.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to address the Employment Services for the Future conference. I would have very much liked to have been able to be there in person and to have heard firsthand about the latest research about new policy ideas. However, the sitting of Parliament means that I'm not able to get out and travel to Melbourne. I am, however, very proud of our government's achievements in employment services over the last 5 years. We've introduced Job Services Australia and Disability Employment Services, and I'm really pleased to say that the results of brave policy decisions are speaking for themselves, with an additional 20,000 job placements per year. We've really focused service delivery on the most disadvantaged job seekers, and we've seen a 90% improvement in their employment rates as a result. Services for job seekers with a disability have also been reformed. For the first time, caps and quotas have been removed, resulting in a 43% increase in the number of people being helped into employment. And this year, I look forward to a 50% increase in the number of service sites for disability employment services as a result of the first full competitive tender. But as I talk to experts and stakeholders, to job seekers and to employers and to community services organisations, I know that there is more to do. And that is why I am seeking your views on how we can improve our employment services system from 2015. Late last year, I released an issues paper, Employment Services Building on Success. This paper captures the main issues that professionals and the community have raised with the government in recent years. Government has also invested in over 100 innovation trials and demonstration pilots to find out firsthand what ideas work best on the ground. And early results show that wraparound services and stronger partnerships are absolutely the key to achieving better outcomes. We know that working with community and health organisations and meeting the needs of employers is also important. And through consultation, we want to know what works and how to do it. And we want to hear from a range of voices, from job seekers to academics, from providers to big business. And what better place to ask advice than in a room full of experts right there today. There are representatives here from the department today who can give you more information about how to get involved. But in conclusion, I'd really like to again thank you and to the University of Melbourne, in particular to Professor Mark Considine, to Professor Helen Sullivan, to Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan and to Ms. Georgie Carr for allowing me to share this short message with you. I really do look forward to hearing of the outcomes of today's conference and importantly to working together as we design an even better employment services system for the future. Really wish I could be there, but please enjoy.
So what I'd like to do is to welcome up to the table Siobhan O'Sullivan, David Grubb, Thomas Braidgard, El Sol, Fleming Larson and Professor Mark Considine. Siobhan's going to chair this session and she'll tell you a bit about how it's going to run and how people are going to speak. Siobhan.
Well, thank you very much and welcome. My name's Siobhan O'Sullivan. I'm a researcher here at the University of Melbourne and I've been involved in conducting research into employment services for the last 5 years. It's wonderful to see everyone in this room. As Helen has said, there's been a lot of planning has gone into this conference, so it's wonderful to finally be here. This morning we have 5 fantastic speakers, people from all around the world who are going to provide us with different perspectives on what's happening in different countries and comparing different countries to each other. But before we get on to that, I just wanted to make one quick message, just give you one quick message. In your conference packs, you have a item that looks like this. It's a flash drive. It was given to us by our partners Jobs Australia, and I just wanted to let you know that this has content on it, so it's not just a flash drive that you can use, although you can. It also actually contains a copy of the issues paper that the Minister just referred to, so if you've not had an opportunity to read the paper, it's on this flash drive, and it also contains a couple of short videos that have been produced by Jobs Australia talking about their vision or their hopes for 2015. So I commend this to you and yeah, please go home and have a look at it. Okay, our first speaker this morning is Professor Mark Considine. Mark is, no doubt, very well known to everybody in this room. Mark is the Dean of Arts here at the University of Melbourne, and he has a long-standing interest in employment services. Many of you, I'm sure, have read Mark's book, Enterprising States, and will be familiar with his research, which, among many other things, includes trying to understand and track changes at the front line in the employment services system in Australia, the UK, and elsewhere. Mark's going to open and speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'm going to invite each of our international guests to give a response for about 10 minutes before I hand it over to the audience for questions. So what I'm going to do is introduce all our international guests so we can go speaker from speaker. First to respond will be Associate Professor Els Sol. Els is from the University of Amsterdam, and Els will also be well known to many people in this room, I'm sure. Els has a very long-standing interest in employment services research. She's worked collaboratively with Mark and with me and with everyone here at the table for many years, and she's the co-chair of the of Rescue, which is an employment services research network, an international employment services research network. She's going to be followed by Associate Professor Thomas Bregard, who I was practising his surname earlier, from Aalborg University in Denmark. Thomas is currently looking at new modes of governance and implementation in regional and local employment councils in Denmark. He's published very widely in the field. He has a long-standing interest in Australia's employment system and is also, naturally enough, an expert in European matters. We also have Flemming Larsen, Professor Flemming Larsen, who's also from Aalborg and who also works very closely with Thomas, but has also collaborated with many of the people here today. And Flemming has a similar range of interests, long-standing interest in employment services reform in Europe and in Australia. And I was very lucky yesterday to hear quite a bit of Flemming and Thomas's work. Our final speaker is Thomas Grubb. Thomas is from the OECD and he has a very long-standing interest in employment services matter. David Grubb. David has recently published a report that no doubt he'll be speaking about into reforms in the Australian employment services system, and we're going to hear a bit more about that today. But David is very much an expert in the field and brings a very interesting international perspective to our own employment services system. So no doubt you're going to find everything our speakers have to say very interesting, and I'll start by welcoming Mark to the lectern.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Helen, and the team for the hard work getting us all to this point. And welcome. Many familiar faces in the room, and organisations, as already been acknowledged, who have not only supported this work but really are an active part of it. And I wanted to add to all of those important acknowledgements the people who fill out our surveys and agree to be interviewed and allow us to come and talk to them in job centres and local offices. We know this isn't the highest thing on your weekly priorities, that it really does make a difference, and we hope that through events like this we can give back some of the learning, some of the insight, or at least better embellish the hard questions that we all ask one another from time to time about employment services. We've already mentioned the collaborators, but particularly in regard to the study, and I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about the methodology behind the study, but happy to answer questions about that. Suffice to say, we've been for some years now looking at employment services reform from a frontline perspective. And that's not the only perspective you could take, but Dan, Els, Jenny Lewis, Siobhan and the team, and others like Thomas and Fleming, we share an interest in trying to figure out how the kind of grand scope of policy making, the big intentions, the ministerial and governmental preferred solutions to these issues, how they get translated when they hit the front line. This is not an evaluation. There are many other excellent teams around the place who do evaluation work and can tell you the net effect of all of this when it all lands on the ground. Ours is much more about that kind of intersection. And it's a perspective we think tells us a lot, doesn't tell us everything, but tells us a lot about the process by which public services become different and perhaps transformative. And that's what I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about today in relation to some of the survey results, just a slice of them, including the most recent, the 2012 survey here in Australia, to see what we think might be happening as these transformative effects of policy roll out into the front line. Now, missing from this story will be the obvious characters in the unemployment story, the unemployed. We would need a different method and a different approach to also capture how their experiences play into this frontline experience. Now, we and you, many of you who work in the industry, will be equipped to add that perspective, or at least to report on what you think is happening. But our view is that at least by trying to see how it looks from the front line looking out and the interactions that we think are occurring, we can tell something important about the likely experiences of clients, job seekers, customers, citizens, and all the other ways in which they might be described. So those are our collaborators, already mentioned. Let's start with the broader perspective on why we got into this issue in the first place, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's worth acknowledging in a conference that's dealing explicitly with employment services, that they are a kind of canary in the mine shaft for a range of other transformations occurring in the public sector in Australia and more broadly. And one of the reasons I think, as a political scientist, I got interested in this area was they were and still are in many ways at the cutting edge of the debate about how public services should be created and delivered. And many of the arguments that are starting to occur in other sectors have been arguments and debates in the employment services area for at least 15 years. So there's a lot we can learn about the experiences of this particular set of institutions, but there's also a lot to learn from that about the broader debate about the shape of government, the nature of relationships with clients and citizens. Traditional public services back in the late 80s were caught, as some of you will recall, in major conflicts about purpose, about budget, about dealing with public debt, some of which has returned with a vengeance in a number of systems since the global financial crisis, trying to find ways to make services more efficient, trying to find ways to make them cheaper, trying to find ways to be more targeted and specific about the kind of support governments put in. And in the various reform strategies of that period, the PES, the Public Employment System, it's the CES in Australia, it has different names in every country, but the Public Employment System was very high on the list of government targets for reform, and we'd need a longer time to talk about why they perhaps decided to start here. But in many countries, including Australia, a new reform narrative developed very quickly around the PES. And it was a narrative that very quickly united the moderate ends of both sides of politics. So one of the things we always know is a kind of a pause and wait moment is when you get the moderates on both sides agreeing essentially that a major set of changes is needed. Now, part of the narrative of change were a series of kind of, right around the world, a series of sort of launch moments. In Australia there were two Keatings involved in this reform, but the Keating referred to here was the Prime Minister of the day, who had a kind of what he thought was, or described as, a personal story of transformation about the CES, which was that at 6 minutes to 5, no matter what was going on, he thought they would just close the door and a queue of people would be sent home. And he had a person that lived next door or over the road who'd had that experience, and it got him mad, really mad. In Germany, similar arguments about the PES being a sort of giant patronage machine and a sudden loss of faith in certain aspects of the public service. The one that in the research literature is quite transformative is a moment in the evaluation of the GAIN program in California, very big employment program in California, and a very important evaluation, which brought to the surface a kind of iconic moment in which a particular site at Riverside was shown to have much, much better results than Los Angeles County and various of the other counties in the 6-county study. And the attention focused on what was different about Riverside. And suddenly, as we say, there was a kind of Riverside fever around the world, because things that were seeming to be happening at Riverside looked like they were transferable anywhere you might like. In New Zealand, now probably forgotten, but I remember being there at the time, the pressure was rather on targets and setting targets and getting competitive results from local employment service officers. And the entrepreneurial management theory of the day, led by this kind of 9 o'clock news idea, was that at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning in the head office of the employment service, every one of the 37 or whatever it was local employment officers, public officers, would fax in their results for the previous week in 12 or 15 set categories: number of jobs, number of people into training, etc. And they would all come in on a weekly basis, and when you spoke to the people in the offices, it was a terror moment, because of course they were then all compiled and a sort of hit list was created. So these ideas were part of a much bigger set of transformations that I don't want to pause and drill into, but happy to talk about in the discussion, because they inform the employment services story in a very, very important way. They provide a lot of the architecture, a lot of the arguments about preferred architecture, that on their own the dilemmas of the system itself wouldn't necessarily help us understand. That the appetite for ministers and governments to make significant changes in employment services is only partly about trying to solve problems there, and is also about trying to solve problems or address bigger issues about the shape and purpose of the public service and the public sector more generally. And some of you will be around long enough to remember the steering not rowing debate. Perhaps some of you are aware of the arguments inside economics and political science about agency theory and the importance of information asymmetry, contracting problems inside organisations, opportunism and the like. These all drove their way through the Australian system, and in some reform in the other countries that we've been studying. The Keating reforms in '94, contracted case management, the first very expansive model for delivering core public services at the front line by non-public servants. Major reforms in the UK through the development of the Employment Service as an executive agency about the same time. The Netherlands begins experimenting with bringing non-public servants organisations, temporary work agencies, somewhat into the story. New Zealand creates its famous, perhaps infamous, agreement-based, contract-based public service delivery. So researching this frontline story is also about researching the architecture of program delivery, and contracting out plays a very big part in that, in all of these stories. But it's not just a procurement story. There's been procurement in this sector and every other sector for as long as anybody can remember. It's not about saying we need to procure services from specialist agencies. It's about saying we need those specialist agencies to now take over the work that was previously done by public servants. And the argument about why that should be and what effect it has is the core of our study. We're going So I won't rehearse in great detail the nature of the model, because many of you here in the room are aware of it, but it's a single national tender, usually a 3-year contract. The Department of Employment, in its various different names over the years, is the purchaser. Number of private agencies, starting with about 300 in the early days, down to, well, I thought it was 109, but I think we were saying yesterday at last count it's probably under 100 now. Centrelink as the referral point, but not delivering the core service. Clients profiled into streams or groups, and there's been various versions of this. We're up to 4 at the moment. And then payments made to contractors based on a kind of degree of difficulty assessment, very contentious but important part of the architecture. And then a payment period for the contractor with some kind of start-up payment to get them going, and then a payment by results, or an attempt to figure out what a results equivalent might look like. And some other activity payments for doing things along the way. And importantly, in the Australian context, a very complex and I think very innovative star rating, Michelin star type system for rating the performance of the agencies. And I should declare a slight, very slight interest here in having worked on the government's review of the star rating model. I don't take any responsibility for either the model or the subsequent version of it, but I was involved in that, and I think win, lose or draw, whether you like the model, it is certainly up there with the high impact tools that can be used. Contractors are assessed using a 5-star system. They're not any longer all exposed to external competition. There are now rollover provisions, so successful performers can be given further contracts or even increased contracts, and then an exit strategy for those who don't meet a minimum. There is a KPI, a key performance indicator for quality, much debated, and there are legendary debates and issues and problems at different times with issues to do with creaming and parking. And what we would call herding, a tendency for everybody to do the same thing at certain times. I should say before we get into the data, I don't myself think these are worse than the equivalent problems you find in other systems, but I don't think that's an excuse. I think any kind of system like this needs to be vigilant and constant in its debate about and its willingness to be open to discussion about how to deal with perennial problems of creaming and parking. Low outcomes for the most disadvantaged. Australia has done better in this regard, but as evaluators say, there's an old joke about program evaluators. You go to a program evaluators conference and see somebody you haven't seen for years and say to them, how's your wife, how's your husband? And the response is, well, compared to what? There is no doubt a comparative story about the impressive impact of the Australian system, which doesn't, in my view, in any way diminish the fact that there is a lot of work still to be done in figuring out why our results for the hardest to reach, the most disadvantaged, aren't better than they are. And fraud. In any contracting and procurement system, there are going to be fraud issues, not only in Australia, we're now seeing in other countries. There is a percentage of providers who will come into a system and look for opportunities to take the money and not do the job. And that has been a constant issue, a constant heartbeat in the Australian system, trying to figure out from a government point of view and certainly from a citizen perspective how you restrain that, how you stop it, but also how the measures you take against it can be prevented from infecting the relationships in the rest of the system. Very, very complex challenge for government. The argument of the study was that there are sort of two intersecting issues that we need to think about. This whole question of new governance and how we can get the right architecture for public services, not only in employment services, and the question embedded in employment services, which is activation. How can we get clients in the system to be more actively involved in doing the things that we want to do? And how much of that, great. How much of that is a result of the governance arrangements? That is, to what extent does the way we carry out the system administratively affect the behaviour of the people who use it? Now, in one version of public service, you just open the door and you have a certain service and you give it to them and they take it away. In another, much more modern version, more contemporary version, everything you do in the interaction is in fact part of the service. And if those interactions are done well, or badly, the takeaway for the client is affected in a very massive and important way. And this results in an argument about the extent to which government, when it procures services from third parties, is able to get the kind of detailed relationship with the client that they're looking for. Now, we expected that in the Australian system, private agencies, for-profit and non-profit, would become very highly innovative in reaching the target set. We thought that in the studies that we did starting back in the late 90s, that the effect of the purchasing regime would be to make agencies who were delivering services very attentive to the incentive structure, and therefore reading the effect of the incentive structure, the payment structure and other rollover and contracting systems, reading that as an indicator of how relationships with clients would be affected was a kind of purpose of this frontline study. So let me just now spend a few minutes giving just the highlights for this. There is a different version of this in the pack, which is comparing Australia and New Zealand, and we will put out an industry report just on the Australian data in the not too distant future. What's happened over the time? We've been surveying in the late 90s, we surveyed again in 2008 and then 2012. So in Australia we've got about 3 or even 4 data points for looking at what's happened at the front line. These are the statistically significant changes. There's a lot of other data in this survey that is arguable, but these are the ones that we believe stand up as significant. The frontline population of staff has become significantly more female. It's about 61 or 62% of the employees at the frontline in 98, 77 by 2012. The frontline case managers, consultants, they go by various names now, are also significantly younger. The number under 34 was about 28% back in the late 90s. It's now about 43%. They're less educated, if we count having a bachelor's degree as a sort of medium measure of education. And in the for-profit sector, they're more likely to be female. Now, Siobhan's got a paper later in the conference where she'll talk about some of these things. There'll be lots of opportunity to debate. Why? I've got some speculations we'll offer at the end of the minute, but nonetheless, the trend data is pretty compelling. Caseloads, which are the number of clients allocated to each individual worker at the front line, also have shown significant change, and I would argue reflect policy shifts at the purchaser level. So the average, and obviously there can be a big spread or a big deviation from the mean in each case, but the average tells us, just that, what was happening comparatively over time. In the late 90s, it's about 115 per case manager. It dropped to 93 in 2008, we think as a result of changes in the regulatory regime, and then back up to about 114 in 2012. We asked people at the front line, what percentage of that caseload are you following closely? And that's increased. It's about 40% that were being followed closely back then, and it was not long after that we had lots of arguments about parking. The then Secretary of the Department told me at an ANU conference when we showed the first data from the 1990s, there is no parking, or if there is any parking, it's just self-parking. It's nothing to do with the system. But in fact, when you talk to people under pressure at the front line, they have to manage large caseloads and they have to figure out pretty quickly who's getting a lot of service and who's getting less. So that's gone up, that's increased. The numbers who frontline staff tell us, not what the evaluation data shows, but the numbers who tell us what's happened to placements into work has decreased. So in the last month we say, how many have you placed into work? 9.8 in 2008, 8.10 in 2012. Now they may be placing them elsewhere, but this is the in-work placement. The number who are getting sanctioned, that is, who are being found to be in breach of some part of their requirement, has increased. So our question is, in the last 2 weeks, how many have you recommended for sanction? Not how many does the federal government record, but you personally. 1.7 up to 5.8, now up to 6.5. We've got a lot in our study about the connectedness of the service at the front line to other agencies, because implicit on, well certainly explicit in the study, but perhaps implicit in the survey is the idea that connectedness at the front line is a way of mobilising services, getting a sort of tailored approach to finding welfare here and perhaps housing support there and other things. So we ask a lot of our respondents to tell us how they're connected, what kinds of agencies they're connected to. What I'm calling here functional connection back to government departments, usually to try and resolve benefit payment issues and the like, that's decreased over time. It was a very high proportion of what the frontline was doing in the first version of this system, ringing up a government department on behalf of a client to solve a problem. That's now gone from 17 down to about 9. Interactions with employers has gone down, and we find this in other countries as well. Frontline staff are less likely to be interacting. Still a high level, 36% say they have daily contact, but significantly lower than it was. But what we call support connections have increased. So how often do you get in contact with a welfare agency? It's gone from a very low base, mind you, and this was one of the shocks of the first survey. We thought there would be more of this because many of these clients are clients with high barriers and big challenges. About 3.6 back then, up to 11. Training providers very significantly increased in the Australian case. Again, almost certainly a mixture of both purchaser preferencing and supply and changed strategies on the part of agencies. And local service clubs have also increased. Pressure to get an outcome quickly. Now there's a work first literature that many of you be aware of. Just push them into the first available job, then let them sort it out. We have a question which actually is developed from one of the American evaluations. We asked them, to what extent is getting an outcome quickly the main priority? That's actually declined over time in Australia. About 41% said that was the main purpose. That's now down to 38. Not a massive drop, but a significant drop across the period. And we think creaming has declined a bit, that the urge to pick the most capable and assist them versus work with everybody on the basis of their needs, that's dropped from a pretty high rate in Australia, 26% in the first survey, down to 10. So the work first approach, certainly by the 2012 survey, is showing significant and important declines. Get a job quickly versus raise skill level and look for a better job. Again, another often used evaluation measure, first developed in the US. About 50% in the first survey were in that work first orientation. That's now down to 25. So numerical targets are now more important than they were before. We asked them to what extent do numerical targets guide what you do at the front line. That's gone from a very high 64 to an even higher 71. Frontline workers are much more conscious than they were. Financial performance is much more important at the front line and is understood by frontline workers as being more important than it was. 51 knew that in the late 90s. Now 65 say the objective of this job is to maximise the organisation's financial outcomes. Now that's not, in one sense, surprising in a system that's devised around contractors who have to make money to stay in business, but it's now a very important part of, if you like, the relationship between the front line and the clients. And a stronger focus on shifting maximum numbers of clients off benefits. That has jumped dramatically in Australia. 58 say that that's the priority 15 years ago, and 83, 84 say that that's now the priority. I focus actions on actions with clients that will generate a payable outcome for my office. 41 were saying that was the approach they took back then. 66 now say quite explicitly that's how the job and the work is organised. And I'm aware that the organisation pays attention to the income that I generate. That is, so a kind of local, personal sense of responsibility. You can see the figures for that, 70 up to 84. Surprisingly, I was surprised by this, the number of people who are receiving incentive payments has dropped significantly in Australia. It was high and higher than the other countries we were studying way back then, at 54. It's dropped down to 44. And in a bit of time, I'll have hope at the end when I compare for-profits with non-profits, you can see there's a widening gap in this story. How are we going for time?
Quite short.
say 5 minutes?
5 minutes, good. And we can always come back in the questions if you need to know more. What is the non-profit, for-profit distinction? Now, you might say there's a prior question, do we care? Well, I care. And we can talk about why I care later. But right from the beginning, we've been trying to figure out what's the value add, first of all, by having the for-profits. We've always had non-profits in this sector. What have we added by putting for-profits into the game from a frontline perspective? But also, now that the thing has evolved, is there any difference between them? Well, the short answer is not much, but the longer answer is there are still some persistent and interesting differences. Slightly higher caseloads in the for-profits, statistically significantly higher, not just a bit of a random result. In each of the 3 survey periods, the caseloads for for-profits are a bit higher. They also see more clients each day in the for-profits. Higher numbers placed into work, that's a direct result of having seen more and having more on your caseload. Higher rates of sanctioning, so 8.9% for the for-profits versus 5.9 in the non-profit, still pretty high in both cases, you might say. And higher contact rates with employers. Now, there's a lot of speculation in the employment services industry around the world about what the business model of different organisations might be. This is not an answer to that question, but it's an indicator of where business models are still potentially quite different and quite important in their differences. More likely to favour a quick outcome in the first 2 periods, that's for-profits. More likely to go for the quick outcome back in the 90s and by 2008, but that's disappeared in the survey results by 2012. They're much more similar in the way they approach the immediate outcome versus get something sustainable. More likely to favour any job over any form of training in the first 2 periods, but that's levelled out by last year, by 2012. These are, I think, we can talk about this in the discussion, almost certainly results of changes in the purchasing arrangement and in the contract. And in work first terms, the not-for-profits obviously have had a strong impact in this sector. And after a short, we asked them exactly how this might affect the interactions with clients. This is the question in the survey. After a short time attending your service, average job seeker offered a low-skilled, low-paying job that would make them better off financially. Assume he has 2 choices, or she has. Take the job and leave welfare, or stay on benefits and wait for a better opportunity. What would your advice be? Take the job and leave welfare. For-profits agree 75% of the time. Non-for-profits agree 81% of the time. That is a significant turnaround by 2012. In 1998, for-profits were more likely to agree 79 to 73. The for-profits run a more incentive-based front line, more likely to say that financial outcomes are monitored, far more likely to receive incentive pay. I showed you the aggregate figure before. Here's that figure pulled apart. 90% are getting incentive payments at the front line versus 35 or 36% in the not-for-profit. More likely to favour quick outcomes in 2008, but pretty much the same by 2012. That's got to do with the payment regime, I think. Summary, frontline service reflects what the purchaser pays for. Now that's good news if you think ministers are in the business of doing public policy in order to get what governments went out and asked for. These systems are, I think, extraordinarily responsive to shifts in the central incentive system. It's folly to think that agencies will use their spare capacity to work on more difficult clients. That's not what these data, and these are not comprehensive, but in the interview data as well, there's not a lot of spare capacity at the front line. These people are seeing more clients more quickly and having as high caseloads and doing more with them. There isn't a sense in any of the answers or the data that there's leftover capacity to do that work. Changes of government do result in shifts that run all the way through to the front line. Business models by these organisations then converge over a very similar delivery approach. Yes, there are differences, and the star ratings show that they do it more better or worse, but there's a convergence, as you've seen, in non-profit, for-profit, and there's a convergence across the sector in the way they go about it. These focus upon the cheapest front line, and we've seen the demographics for that, less networking overall, high financial return models, including down to the level of the frontline worker, and high efficiency in turning clients through the system. And this is made more attractive by contracts that shift agencies around the country. We can get into the story of why that somewhat footloose and flexible model helps this approach. Now, there's some other threads we could draw together in terms of what this means for public services more broadly, but I think rather than head down that path, I should stop and we can cover some of that in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. And now we're going to hear from Elsa. Welcome, Elsa.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and good day to you all. Very happy to be here. Always very interesting, all the developments in Australia here. Well, I want to bring you to the other end of the world, where it's very cold right now. It's snowing. And more specifically to a small country called the Netherlands, 17 million inhabitants, where things in employment services are happening more or less along the same lines, but a little bit different from, I think, the story Mark just told you. And I just got 10 minutes, so I chose for one topic, and that's connectedness. Max told us a lot about that. This is just part of the story, as you will understand. I will not talk about the services to the short-term unemployed, which are digital services right now in the Netherlands. So there's no face-to-face contact in the first 3 to 9 months. What I will talk about is the services to all the others, being people on welfare and people with a disability benefit. And the fact is that, like I said, I'm talking about connectedness, and it's about local connectedness that I want to talk about, because the new coalition, which we have since September, has decided to bring all the services at the local level. And maybe you've heard this before. In the Netherlands, we have a decentralized system whereby all the municipalities, more than 300, are responsible, financially as responsible for welfare. And their policy is more or less autonomous. The only thing they have to take care of is that the balance is okay and they are in the black figures. That's more or less what they're supposed to do. And they're supposed to do this under major budget cuts. There's a financial crisis, as you are aware of probably, which hit us a little bit more than Australia. And that means that we had major budget cuts. So there's a big problem for the municipalities as to how to deliver services. What do the municipalities do in order to deliver the services they think are in order? Well, they've got now employment services for people on welfare to organize, also for young disabled. And there used to be a lot of sheltered workplaces in the Netherlands, more than 300,000. But due to the budget cuts, the government brought them back to 30,000 places. So for all the other people on sheltered workplaces, there has to be another solution arranged at the local level. Not only the employment services are brought at the local level, but due to the fact that people that are dependent on these services are all local in the sense that they depend on the local labor market, they also depend on other services like home care, for their housing. So the central government brought these services also down to the municipal level. And the challenge for the municipalities is how to organize all these services, wraparound services you'd call them, together under major budget cuts. Well, this isn't easy, and what we see happening now is that they are tendering just on price. So, for example, what we see is, for example, for home care, that the services that are being delivered are not the same quality as we used to have before. So that's a problem there, especially for the multiple buried people who are dependent on all these different type of services. We see the quality going down. So there's a problem there. The municipalities don't only try and organize the services at the supply side, like I just talked about childcare, homes, employment, but they also try to connect to the demand side of the labor market in order to get the employment services they think are needed. And for this, they have changed the focus. Before, the focus was very much in employment services on changing behavior of the unemployed. That still is there, but there's more focus now on the employer side. And for example, I give you some examples. For example, the municipalities have now realized that they are themselves a major employer. I'll give you an example. They try to connect when they are in need themselves for new personnel, for flex personnel. What they do is now tender for these services and ask temp work agencies who work for them to bring in their personnel, but under the condition of social return, which means that they are obliged to bring in also a certain percentage of people on welfare or disadvantaged. Also, they use more work-focused social enterprises to deliver services in their in the neighborhoods. And there are other examples I could give you. This, of course, is all new policies, and what we see is a new world of employment services developing there. There's a discussion, as there's here, there we have discussions in the Netherlands too, about parking, about creaming, how can the temp work agencies, for example, deliver the services needed for these people. We see more connectedness between temp work function, temp work agency function, and employment services function. So a differentiation within providers, the company. So they deliver now more types of services than they did before. We also see new developments in non-profit temp agencies developing, and that is important, I think. As a researcher, I see that it's more and more difficult for people at the lower end of the labor market to get regular employment. It's only a small percentage that, when you look at it from a career perspective, a work career perspective, that are able these days to get a regular permanent job. So I think the time is right in Europe to try and think more about how to create a working career for people that are dependent on flex jobs. I'll leave it at that. So what we are thinking about now is, for example, learning accounts for people on flex jobs, so they can be in the labour market for a longer period of time. These are some of the new developments I'd like to talk about, and thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, I think the organizers announced in the program that Thomas Bredgaard now should be the speaker, but I'm not Thomas Bredgaard. I'm Flemming Larsen, but we changed the order because I would make some more general comments, I guess. But thanks for being here. It's very nice being here in Australia. As Els said, we are coming from very freezing temperatures and snow, so this is really wonderful to be here in Australia. Our background is, Thomas and I, that we have been here once before, also during the winter time in Denmark. And we were studying, and I think actually I could see from yesterday we had interviewed some of you actually in 2005 in a study we made where we make a comparative study between Australia, the Netherlands and Denmark. But since then I've also worked with the UK and Germany. So I think my comments are more of a general character. And I have to say that the organizer wrote to me that I asked them what to say for this occasion here, and they said that we are very happy for you to take it in whatever direction you think is most suitable. So all complaints must go to them. But I'll make a few comments for Mark's Constantine's presentation, comparing it to some of the developments in many other European countries. And then I'll have some more general reflections on how marketization can maybe change in another direction in order to solve the problem that I think most countries are facing for the moment into employment service, namely the integration of the most disadvantaged unemployed with multiple barriers to re-enter the labour market. I think it was a very interesting presentation you gave, Mark. I can say that we have seen the same patterns in Denmark and other European countries, that employment services has been more and more controlled by central political and administrative decision makers, and thereby also become much more standardized, the services that are implemented. We've seen all these same types of new governance elements, numerical targets, standardized profiling system. I remember we first saw this job seeker classification system here in Australia, and we nearly came back to Denmark and we had the same types of system, which was nearly similar, and we've seen this in many other countries too. We've seen prescribed services for certain target groups, when to contact with the unemployed, in a kind of contact regimes, certain hours or numbers of application for job search activities, etc., etc. And all this has been somehow embedded in a performance measurement system where you're measuring employment outcomes, use of sanction, test of job search activities, interviews in time, etc. I could say this is a kind of standardized minimum services. But all this is also followed, of course, with a lot of rules, a lot of things to do. I read in the Danish newspaper yesterday that one of the providers in Denmark had tried to print out all the regulations in this area. And it turned out there was 20,408 pages. I don't know if this is the case here, but probably, I would guess. But what is the most, I think, interesting also in the Mark's presentation is that it seems to work. Actually, you can see there's an organizational behavior change, and you can see that the service deliverers also change. We made a study at the Danish municipals in 2001 and followed it with a new study in 2008. And it showed exactly the same tendencies as Mark presented today. Governance reforms are used to change organizational and frontline behavior. One of our Dutch colleagues, Rick van Berkel, he called this a triple activation. It's not only the unemployed that must be activated, so must the service agencies and the frontline staff. What is then implemented is a kind of work first, with focus on pressure, incentives to work, or being actively job seeking. And what we see is, of course, more or less personalized services. It's more like processing people nearly, and there's also a low investment in use of training, education, skill improvement. This happens both in public and the contracted services. But should I compare, I would say maybe that the contracted services have been most effective way to do this simply by placing the risk at the provider side and combining it with high price competition, because then you nearly compete on costs instead of competing on what's in the services. And this gives little room for personalized, innovative and training skills-based services. But again, I think the non-public providers, they do what they are paid for, so to speak. But again, we must remember this also takes place in the public services. We can see in many of the European countries, as Els mentioned, that many of these services are decentralized into local units as well. And they work under exactly the same types of incentives that the providers would do in a contracted system. So there's so many similar patterns, and we have to remember it's not only the contracted services that is like that. But the services has been changed toward a kind of work first, and it seems at least at the short run quite successfully, putting more emphasis on people's work orientation. We have to remember this. This has actually been quite a success story. But without doubt, it's effective if the unemployed are able to find employment themselves. That's actually the premise of this. But what has been less successful, and that's, I think, what we can see in many countries with this strategy, is that the labor market integration of people without the ability to find employment themselves, with many types of barriers, a long distance to regular employment. There we have a problem. That's why we can see there is a pressure for changing the employment services for this group. In Denmark, this is for the moment maybe the hottest political issue, how to address the services for these groups. And I think we need somehow to address it with a more tailored and personalized service, and maybe also new types of investments in this type of services. And the good question is, being in Australia, is of course, can this be integrated into a contracted system? Because more tailored, at the first end you should just say yes, because more tailored services include more freedom for the design and deliverance of services. You should suppose there would be such a kind of freedom in a contracted system. I'm not sure though, because of the mechanisms I described before about how you control and steer this system. Because the basic problem is, of course, how to secure accountability. We have basically 4 types of accountabilities. We have the democratic accountability, administrative accountability, then we have trying to displace them with market accountability, and there's what we could call network accountability. But what we have seen is that we tried actually to displace somehow of the democratic and administrative accountability with market accountability. But the problem is that it's a kind of layering. All is still in place. The only thing that maybe has been losing on this is what I would call network accountability.
Only 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's perfectly all right. Therefore, from my point of view, I think we have a huge task in front of us if we're talking about future systems, is how can we somehow change this types of accountability relation. where we not only base this on pure market accountability mixed with this, because then there's a low trust from the purchaser, which means then we can mix it with other types of accountability forms. But how can we base this on some kind of network accountability? I think that's just a way forward somehow. You can say if you can build up a system that somehow encompass many of these actors and they can agree upon services, this can be a way of securing a kind of accountability. And I think a very important necessary condition for successful services is, in that sense, if you're talking about network and cooperation at a local level, is of course to somehow integrate the employer side in this, because without the employer side coming closer to this type of disadvantaged groups, I think it would be impossible to solve the task. But how to do it? We discussed it yesterday at a seminar. How can we actually make sure that we have some kind of accountability if we want to enforce a kind of network governance? And I have not the answer, and that's the lucky thing of being a researcher. Because what I do for a living is not always just to have all the answers, that's asking also the questions. So hopefully that's what we'll be doing for the next period, is to try to address this problem about how can you actually change these types of services and use also other types of governance forms. Thank you.
So, my name is Thomas Bredgaard from Denmark. And Els took you to Holland, which he said was a small country and a cold country. I'll tell you, Denmark is even smaller and it's much colder. So it's only 5 million inhabitants. And if you have heard something about Danish employment services, it might have been the word flexicurity. Flexicurity is a description of a quite flexible labor market in which there are very liberal dismissal laws. And this is combined with a social security system which is quite generous and enhances the mobility of the workforce. And this Danish system has been quite well known across the world, and a number of countries has been inspired by this Danish flexicurity. And one element of this flexicurity model is the active labor market policies. So the idea is here to combine two separate effects. One is work first, or what you could call a motivation effect, to ensure that the unemployed are motivated to take and seek ordinary jobs. And the other effect is a qualification effect or human capital effect, to ensure that the unemployed have the qualifications which are demanded by employers. So you need to balance the two, and for a number of years the Danish system was quite good at balancing these two effects. Activation policies in Denmark has also been quite famous across Europe, at least. And it has been based on the combination of rights and responsibilities, like in Australia, in which you call it mutual obligations. But what I'll talk about is a less familiar policy of contracting out the public employment service. Unlike in Australia, there's not a full-scale marketization in Denmark. So there are parallel service providers. Some private companies. We don't have these not-for-profit companies in Denmark. And then, on the other hand, there's still a public employment service or local job centers. So these two providers are living side by side and provide actually the same services. So if you look at this slide, it shows the share of the unemployed who has been contracted out on the market. It began back in 2003. And you can see it's almost like a roller coaster ride. There's been 3 periods which I'll briefly describe. The first period was the construction of this market from 2003 to 2005, in which a market for employment services was created. It was 2-year tendering rounds in local labor market regions. There was 14 regions, and each of them had a lot of flexibility and freedom to decide payment models, which types of target groups should be contracted out, how to monitor the market, how to measure effects. So it was a very intransparent market. And it was heavily subsidized by the government in the beginning. And of course, the idea here was to attract providers to this new market. Mainly, what was contracted out was not activation services, but in the beginning, so-called contact interviews. So each 3 months, the public employment service or the private providers had to make an interview with the unemployed. This was a new task for the PES, and it was a way to relieve the public employment service of this new administrative burden to put it out on the market. But of course, there's little room for innovation and flexibility in doing a 1-hour interview each 3 months. So there wasn't much competition on activation services. Now, you may have noticed that I call them other actors. It's because when this idea about contracting was enacted by the Parliament, it was quite unpopular. And it was a liberal minister, but he had to persuade the Social Democrats that this was a good idea. So he said, we call them other actors, and the unemployment insurance funds, as well as the trade unions, they can also compete on this market. So that's why they called them other actors. And that was one of the mechanisms to secure the political support of the Social Democrats. The use of these other actors really increased quite rapidly. So around 2005, almost 45% of all unemployed was contracted out. Then in the next period, you can see how we slide down until around 2009. There was quite some criticism of what was happening on the market. And one example was the National Audit Office, which criticized this new market for being intransparent, as I mentioned before, not being sufficiently focused on rewarding and measuring outcomes. So actually, for quite a number of years, there wasn't any national database for benchmarking these private providers. So it was very difficult also for the unemployed to see who were the best performers. And also, this market was not a market for specialized providers or specific target groups, which was the political intention, but rather it became a general device to relieve administrative pressure of the public employment service. I think there are 2 explanations for this decline. The one is that unemployment was declining in this period. When it came to 2008, there was only a 4% unemployment rate in Denmark. So there was not the same pressure to use a private provider to relieve the public employment service. Yeah. And another explanation was an action plan of the Ministry of Employment, which led to a dramatic reduction of the market. And as Mark explained, in Denmark, it was also a much tighter regulation of the market. It became much more standardized. National tenders was enforced. A new payment model was introduced in which 75% was given as outcome payments. Okay, so in the final period from 2009 until now, Denmark was first hit as all other countries of the world by the global financial crisis, and Denmark is still struggling to escape from this crisis. So open unemployment has more than doubled and is about 8% at the moment. There's been a massive job destruction. In the first 2 years of the crisis, it seemed as if these other actors was once again used to relieve the public employment service of this administrative burdens of an increasing unemployment rate. But then in 2010, there was a massive criticism of the market and this entire activation industry. So the financial transfers from the state government to local governments was reformed, and it was made less attractive for local governments to use private providers. And you can see now, currently, it's about 10% of the unemployed who are transferred to these other actors. And then we also had a change of government in late 2011 to a social democratic-led government, and they are less convinced about the virtues of marketization. They are also reducing the options for contracting out and trying to turn the tide away from these work-first policies towards a more human capital approach. So in conclusion, although the Danish case is still unsettled, and even if empirical evaluations are scarce, I think it's safe to conclude that contracting out has not been a panacea to a cheaper nor to a better employment service.
Hello everyone. I'm David Grubb from the OECD. Thanks for inviting me. However, I got invited here, to the conference organisers for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to come back to Australia. I've been in Australia previously in the year 2000, which was the preparations for the OECD's publication called Innovations in Labour Market Policies, the Australian Way. And that was essentially a review of well, it was a broad review, in fact, of labour market policies, but within that, clearly a lot of weight given to the youthful job network. And this was regarded as a big innovation in OECD employment policy practices. And then in 2010, I was again here in Australia to go through some interviews and meet different actors in the labour market in preparation for this publication, which is called Activating Job Seekers, How Australia Does It. And just to say, for a longer version of a very compressed version of what we've got, I have a session later on, so I'm not going to give you any PowerPoint now, but those in my session will see something. What is the focus in these, we might call them reviews, of Australian labour market policies? It's firstly, if you had to choose a single theme, it's how does it work now? Describe how it works. Secondly, the history. How did we get there? How did the country, if we're reviewing it particularly, how did policy get to where it is at the moment? And thirdly, thinking about the future. What's recommended for the future? And just to give a sort of two-sentence summary on each of those topics, I believe that the review of Australia at the moment shows or indicates that really the structure of Job Services Australia now is actually different from the way that any other country is doing marketisation. One needs to understand the structure that's created by, I think we've already mentioned the key words. I mean, the JSCI, we've got evaluation of job seeker barriers. We have a national database of job seeker characteristics. We have a star rating system which, differently from a lot of other countries' management indicators, star rating in Australia is meant to be a measure of the impact of the particular site on outcomes, and not just whether it's got 30% or 40% of job seekers into a job, but whether that's actually an increase compared to what would happen in the absence of good performance at that site. It's meant to be a real measure of performance at the site, whereas a lot of other countries only have measures like, one site got 30% into work and the other site got 40% into work, but we don't know whether it's comparable. There are interesting parts of the structure in Australia which is obligatory, as it were, for JSA providers, things like work experience activities. And there's a mixture there of prescription and of freedom on providers of what they're allowed to do. The deal with contract management we consider significant because it's quite different from the black box, so-called black box method of managing employment services, and it gives the department more ability to know that what's going on in different parts of the system is roughly comparable and fair competition. Because if you've got a real black box, it gets more difficult to know that. And also I think it's worth mentioning the focus on disadvantage in Job Services Australia compared to previous models, because now the criticism, on the one hand, that payments are being made for outcomes that would have happened anyway, is not terribly applicable, strongly applicable to Australia. What a reasonable amount has been done to make sure that that's not too much the case. And secondly, the arguments about parking and creaming, Australia has made a big effort to minimise those two, and more in the JSA model than even in its previous versions. And finally, another thing I'd mention is that Centrelink is actually doing quite a lot of work for the job services in Australia, because as Centrelink is managing the flow into JSA provision and the kind of clients which JSA has to work with. And this is actually an important function. Going back to the question, second part of the question, how did Australia get there? So on this, I think I would say that our two reports, given that there was one in 2001 and one here, should be a really good source. They've got a lot of the history in there. You can find a lot of references, for example, to DWA's big evaluations, which it did in the 2000s, of major changes in labour market policy. And we can see the picture of how the system has been gradually brought in. It's also some of the same principles behind JSA today have been gradually applied to disability employment services, and now there's a fair degree of convergence. So all of that is very interesting to study. It takes quite a long time to understand properly. And indeed here, I mean, there's something like 350 to 400 bibliographic references. So, it's not unless you're really studying, you really want to study it in detail, that you're going to go through all of that. Now, then the future. What does this mean for the future? One of the main things is perspective on the outcomes. And at the moment, well, let's go back. In the 1990s, Australia had an average unemployment rate of about 9% over the decade and a peak of around 11%. And like quite a lot of countries. And more recently, it looks as if Australia is able to stay with an unemployment rate of around 5 to 6%, maybe get it down further. And that's... A lot of countries in the OECD have at some stage spent a long time with high unemployment rates, which I believe are generally dysfunctional. That's when the system is not working very well. It's hasn't got a good focus on outcomes. And so one of the main themes for the future for Australia is simply, at the moment, you have a big focus on outcomes. We're talking about them in this room. When we hear Mark talk, we can see that the system is thinking about outcomes all the time. And in a sense, as long as that real focus is really kept there and it's going through the system and down to the front line, then the outcomes will actually stay fairly good. Surprisingly, it may seem, but with bureaucracy and many other things, quite a lot of countries can lose that for long periods. Yeah, okay. The JSA type of solution, when it's successful, offers an opportunity to keep performance up over a long period of years. One thing that I think is sometimes observable with the rest of the world is they may have a public employment service that functions well for 10 or 15 years, but then it begins to drift under various pressures. Its performance may begin to drift away, it loses the focus. But in other countries, it can be very, very hard to reform that. And I mean, we've probably heard of, for example, the Hartz reforms in Germany. But this is a post-war, in the entire post-war period, this is the biggest, most wrenching reform that has happened in the field of German labour market policies. It requires a huge wrenching reform. The outsourced model, if it works well, can keep performance up over a long period. And just because unemployment has been brought down, dependence on inactive benefits has been brought down also in Australia. Between the two of these things, Australia has a relatively high employment rate, and it probably has the lowest percentage of the working age population on what I call an income replacement benefit of the OECD countries that do have a comprehensive social safety net. So the improvement in government finances that is resulting from a relatively good degree of success with the employment policies is very significant. There's more people in employment, there's more people paying tax, fewer people getting benefit. If the money is well used, as it were, that does a great deal to expand the capacity of government as compared to a lot of other countries in the OECD which have let social spending run too far. They've got unemployment rates that are unnecessarily high. And we do see stories of a lot of other things that governments should do well are not being done so well nowadays because of the pressures on public finances. So I think it may sound a simple or crude thing, but Australia's success in keeping the system relatively financially sound is actually a big factor. So, all very interesting. We want to try and explain as much of this also to, not only to you here in Australia, but also to people in the rest of the world.